Hello and welcome back. I'm going to be starting a mini-series where we read Beren and Luthien together. And there's a reason I've chosen Beren and Luthien because outside of the Fellowship, it's probably one of my favourite texts by Tolkien for a multitude of reasons. The tale of Beren and Luthien is deeply entwined with his personal life, especially his relationship with his beloved wife Edith. The story takes a central place in Tolkien's legendarium. This is not only because of its literary and thematic significance, but because it mirrors their love story. Narrative's themes of love, loss, and ultimate reunion resonate profoundly with the experiences and the emotions that both Tolkien and Edith had to live through, making the tale not only personal, but emotional and transformative for himself as a writer and as a man. I think it's so hard to find romance and true love stories that are authentic, just like Tolkien and Edith's, and the fact that he was then able to replay that and incorporate that into this story it's magical. Beren and Luthien is one of the key stories in the Silmarillion, and it revolves around the mortal man Beren and the princess Luthien. Their love is one of defiance, as it crosses boundaries of race, age, and even death. To surmise, the couple's love is forbidden by her father and then fraught with these trials that consistently test their devotion to each other. And I won't spoil it because we're about to read it, but in the end, themes of love transcending all obstacles are central to the story's power. And for Tolkien, the origins of this tale stem solely from his own life experiences. He met Edith when he was just 16 years old, and they fell deeply in love. However, his guardian, Father Francis Morgan, forbade him from courting Edith until he was 21. During this period of separation, he wrote her letters and poetry, such beautiful poetry. I mention it in a video here that I did when I went to visit a spot that they would frequent quite a lot in their youth. All throughout this time, their love remained strong. It never faltered. Once Tolkien was finally able to marry Edith, their bond, it deepened and it remained steadfast, despite the challenges of life, including the Great War and the pressures of Tolkien's academic career. In an often quoted letter, and I have the quote here, so I'm going to read it directly to you, Tolkien writes, "I never called Edith Luthien, but she was the Luthien to me, and I was the Beren." This letter was written to his son Christopher, and it highlights the connection of the characters of Beren and Luthien. In turn, Tolkien's relationship with Edith, his identification with Beren, and his deep affection for Edith as his personal Luthien underscore the personal significance of the myth. In this sense, the tale of Beren and Luthien is a reflection of Tolkien's own love story with Edith, who was his muse, his companion, and his Luthien. So I hope you enjoy. Without further ado, let's go. Beren is a mortal man, but Luthien an immortal elf, and essential to this tale is the fate that shadows their love. Her father, a great elvish lord, is deeply opposed to Beren and imposes on him an impossible task that he must perform before he might wed Luthien. Unduated by Lord Thingol's challenge, Beren and Luthien embark on the supremely heroic attempt to rob Morgoth, the greatest of all evil beings, of a Silmaril, one of the hollowed jewels that adorn the Black Enemy's crown. So it's important to note that obviously this has been edited by Christopher Tolkien, and it wasn't until 2017 that this was released. So there's a lot to get through before the story starts. In terms of the contents, you've got the preface, the notes on the elder days, and then finally Beren and Luthien, and a very long appendix. But let's start with the preface. After the publication of the Silmarillion in 1977, I spent several years investigating the earlier history of the work and writing a book which I called The History of the Silmarillion. Later, this became the somewhat shortened basis of the earlier volumes of The History of Middle-earth. In 1981, I wrote at length to Rayna Unwin, the chairman of Allen and Unwin, giving him an account of what I had been and was still doing. At that time, as I informed him, the book was 1,968 pages long and 16.5 inches across, and obviously not for publication. I said to him, if and or when you see this book, you will perceive immediately why I have said that it is in no conceivable way publishable. The text and other discussions are far too detailed and minute. The size of it is, and will become progressively more so, prohibitive. It is done partly for my own satisfaction in getting things right, and because I wanted to know how the whole concept did in reality evolve from the earliest origins. If there is a future for such inquiries, I want to make sure, as I can, that any later research into J.R.R.T's A Literary History is not turned into nonsense by mistaking the actual course of its evolution. The chaos and intrinsic difficulty of many of the papers, the layer upon layer of challenges in a single manuscript page, the vital clues on scattered scraps found anywhere in the archive, the texts written on the backs of other works, the disordering and separation of manuscripts, the near or total illegibility in places is simply inexaggerable. In theory, I could produce a lot of books out of the history, and there are many possibilities and combinations of possibilities. For example, I could do Beren with the original lost tale, The Lay of Luthien, and an essay on the development of the legend. My preface, if it came to anything so positive, would probably be for the treating of one legend as a developing entity rather than to give all the lost tales at one go. But the difficulties of exposition in detail would in such a case be great, because one would have to explain so often what was happening elsewhere, in other unpublished writings. I said that I would enjoy writing a book called Beren on the lines I suggested, but the problem would be its organisation, and so the matter was comprehensible without the editor becoming overpowering. When I wrote this, I meant what I said about publication. I had no thought of its possibility other than that my idea selecting a single legend as a developing entity, I seem now to have done precisely that, though with no thought of what I had said in my letter to Raynar Unwin 35 years ago. I had altogether forgotten it, until I came on it by chance when this book was all but completed. There is, however, a substantial difference between it and my original idea, which in a difference of context. Since then, a large part of the immense store of manuscripts pertaining to the First Age, or Elder Days, has been published in close and detailed editions, chiefly in the volumes of the History of Middle-earth. The tale of a book devoted to the evolving story of Beren that I ventured to mention to Raynar Unwin as a possible publication would have brought to light much hitherto unknown and unavailable writing. But this book does not offer a single page of original and unpublished work. What then is the need now for such a book? I will attempt to provide an inevitably complex answer, or several answers. In the first place, an aspect of those editions was the presentation of the texts in a way that adequately displayed my father's apparently eccentric mode of composition, often in fact imposed by external pressures, and so to discover the sequence of stages in the development of a narrative and to justify my interpretation of the evidence. At the same time, the First Age of the History of Middle-earth was in those books conceived as a history in two senses. It was indeed a history, a chronicle of lives and events in Middle-earth, but it was also a history of the changing literary conceptions in the passing years, and therefore the story of Beren and Luthien is spread over many years and several books. However, since the story became entangled with the slowly evolving Silmarillion, and ultimately an essential part of it, its developments are recorded in successive manuscripts, primarily concerned with the whole history of the Elder Days. To follow the story of Beren and Luthien as a single and well-defined narrative in the history of Middle-earth is therefore not easy. In an often quoted letter in 1951, my father called it the chief of the stories of the Silmarillion, and he said of Beren that he is, to quote, the outlawed mortal who success and succeeds with the help of Luthien, a mere maiden, even in an elf of royalty. Where all the armies and warriors have failed, he penetrates the stronghold of the enemy and wrests one of the Silmarils from the Iron Crown. And he wins the hand of Luthien, and the first marriage of mortal and immortal is achieved. As such, the story is, I think, a beautiful and powerful heroic fairy romance, receivable in itself with only a very general, vague knowledge of the background. But it is also a fundamental link in the cycle, deprived of its full significance, out of its place therein. In the second place, my purpose in this book is twofold. On the one hand, I have tried to separate the story of Beren and Luthien, so that it stands alone, so far as that can be done, in my opinion, without distortion. On the other hand, I have wished to show how this fundamental story evolved over the years. In my foreword to the first volume of the Book of the Lost Tales, I said of the changes in the stories, to quote, in the history of Middle-earth, the development was seldom by outright rejection. Far more often it was subtle transformation in stages, so that the growth of the legends, the process, for instance, by which the Nargothrond story made contact with that of Beren and Luthien, a contact not even hinted at in the Lost Tales, though both elements were present, can seem like the growth of legends among peoples, the product of many minds and generations. It is an essential feature of this book that those developments in the legend of Beren and Luthien are shown in my father's own words, for the method that I have employed is the extraction of passages from much longer manuscripts in prose or verse written over many years. In this way also, there are brought to light passages of close description or dramatic immediacy that are lost in the summary, condensed manner characteristic of so much Silmarillion narrative writing. There are even to be discovered elements in the story that were later altogether lost. Thus, for example, the cross-examination of Beren and Falaugund, their companions disguised by orcs, by Thu the necromancer, the first appearance of Sauron, or the entry into the story of the appalling Tevildo, Prince of Cats, who clearly deserves to be remembered, short as was his literary life. Lastly, I will cite another of my prefaces, that to the Children of Húrin, in 2007. It is undeniable that there are a very great many readers of The Lord of the Rings for whom the legends of the elder days are altogether unknown, unless by their repute as strange and inaccessible in mode and manner. It is also undeniable that the volumes of the history of Middle-earth in question may well present a deterrent aspect. This is because my father's mode of composition was intrinsically difficult. A primary purpose of the history was to try to disentangle it, thereby, it may seem, exhibiting the tales of the elder days as a creation of unceasing fluidity. I believe that he might have said, in explanation of some rejected element in a tale, I came to see that it was not like that, or I realized that there was not the right time. The fluidity should not be exaggerated, but there were nonetheless great essential permeances. But it was certainly my hope that in composing this book, that it will show how the creation of an ancient legend of Middle-earth, changing and growing over many years, reflected the search of the author for a presentation of myth nearer to his desire. In my letter to Raina Unwin of 1981, I observed that in the event of my restricting myself to a single legend from another of the legends that make up the Lost Tales, the difficulties of exposition in detail would in such a case be great, because one would have to explain so often what was happening elsewhere in other published writings. This has proved an accurate prediction in the case of Beren and Luthien. A solution of some sort must be achieved, for Beren and Luthien did not live, love, and die with their friends and foes on an empty stage, along with no past. I have therefore followed my own solution of the children of Hurin in my preface to the book I wrote. It seems unquestionable from my father's own words that if he could achieve final and finished narratives on the scale he desired, he saw the three great tales of the elder days, Beren and Luthien, the children of Hurin, and the fall of Gondolin, as works sufficiently complete in themselves as not to demand knowledge of the great body of legend known as the Silmarillion. On the other hand, the tale of the children of Hurin is integral in the history of elves and men in the elder days, and there are necessarily a good many references to the events and circumstances in that larger story. I therefore gave a very brief sketch of Beleriand and its peoples near the end of the elder days, and I included a list of all names occurring in the text, with very concise indications concerning each. In this book I have adopted from the children of Hurin that brief sketch, adapting and shortening it, and I have likewise provided a list of all names occurring in the texts, in this case with explanatory indications of a very varied nature. None of this ancillary matter is essential, but it is intended merely as an assistance if desired. A further problem which I should mention arose from the very frequent changes of names. To follow with exactness and consistency the succession of names in texts of different dates would not serve the purpose of this book. I have therefore observed no rule in this respect, but distinguish old and new in some cases, but not in others, for various reasons. In a great many cases, my father would alter a name in a manuscript at some later or even much later time, but not consistently. For example, Elfin to Elvin. In such cases, I have even made Elvin the sole form, or Valeriand for earlier Brosliand, but in others I have retained both, such as Tinwillint/Thingol and Artenor or Doriath. The purpose of this book, then, is altogether made different from that of the volumes of the History of Middle-earth, from which it is derived. It is emphatically not intended as an adjunct to these books. It is an attempt to extract one narrative element from a vast work of extraordinary richness and complexity. But that narrative, the story of Beren and Luthien, was itself continually evolving and developing new associations as it became more embedded in the wider history. The decision of what to include and what to exclude of that ancient world at large could only be a matter of personal and often questionable judgment in such an attempt that there is no attainable correct way. In general, however, I have erred on the side of clarity and resisted the urge to explain for fear of undermining the primary purpose and method of the book. In my 93rd year, this is presumptively my last book in the long series of editions of my father's writings, very largely previously unpublished, and is of somewhat curious nature. This tale is chosen in memoriam because of its deeply rooted presence in his own life and his intense thought on the union of Luthien, whom he called, quote, the greatest of the Eldar, and of Beren, the mortal man, of their fates and of their second lives. Sorry, I'm looking at the time. It goes back a long way in my life, for it is my earliest actual recollection of some element in a story of what was being told to me, not simply a remembered image of the scene of the storytelling. My father told it to me, or parts of it, speaking it without any writing, in the early 1930s. The element in the story that I recall in my mind's eye is that of the eyes of the wolves as they appeared one by one of the darkness, within the darkness, of the dungeon of Thu. In a letter to me on the subject of my mother, written in the year after her death, which was also the year before his own, he wrote of his overwhelming sense of bereavement and of his wish to have Luthien inscribed beneath her name on her grave. He returned in that letter, as it's cited on page 29 of this book, to the origin of the tale of Beren and Luthien in a small woodland glade filled with hemlock flowers near Roos in Yorkshire, where she danced, and he said, to quote, "But the story has gone crooked, and I am left, and I cannot plead before the inexorable Mandos." And we now start on the notes of the elder days. In time to which this story reaches back was memorably conveyed in a passage in Lord of the Rings. At the Great Council in Rivendell, Elrond spoke of the last alliance of elves and men, and the defeat of Sauron at the end of the Second Age, more than 3,000 years before. To quote, "Thereupon Elrond paused a while and sighed. I remember well the splendour of their banners," he said. "It recalled to me the glory of the elder days, and the hosts of Beleriand. So many great princes and captains were assembled, and yet not so many, nor so fair, as when Thangorodrim was broken, and the elves deemed that evil was ended for ever, and it was not so." "You remember," said Frodo, speaking his thought aloud in his astonishment. "But I thought," he stammered as Elrond turned towards him, "I thought that the fall of Gil-galad was a long age ago." "So it was indeed," answered Elrond gravely. "But my memory reaches back even to the elder days. Erendil was my sire, who was born in Gondolin before its fall, and my mother was Elwing, daughter of Dior, son of Luthien of Doriath. I have seen 3 ages in the west of the world, and my defeats, and many fruitless victories." To move on, it says here, of Morgoth. Morgoth, the Black Enemy, as he came to be called, was in his origin, as he declared to Húrin, brought captive before him. Melkor, first and mightiest of the Valar, who was before the world, now become permanently incarnate, in form a gigantic and majestic but terrible king in the northwest of Middle-earth. He was physically present in his huge fortress of Angband, the Hells of Iron, the black reek that issued from the summits of Thangorodrim. The mountains that he piled above Angband could be seen far off, staining the northern sky. It is said in the Annals of Beleriand that the gates of Morgoth were but 150 leagues from the bridge of Mengroth, far and yet all too near. These words refer to the bridge leading to the dwellings of the elvish king Thingol. They were called Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. But being incarnate, Morgoth was afraid. My father wrote of him to quote, "As he grew in malice, he sent forth himself the evil that he conceived in lies and creatures of wickedness. His power passed into them and was dispersed, and he himself became ever more earthbound, unwilling to issue from his dark strongholds. Thus, when Fingolfin, High King of the Noldorian Elves, rode alone to Angband to challenge Morgoth to combat, he cried at the gate, 'Come forth, thou coward king, and fight with thine own hand. Den-dweller, wielder of thralls, liar and lurker, foe of gods and elves, come, for I would see thy craven face.' Then, it is told, Morgoth came, for he could not refuse such a challenge before the face of his captains. He fought with the great hammer Grond, which at each blow made a great pit, and he beat Fingolfin to the ground. But as he died, he pinned the great foot of Morgoth to the earth, and the black blood gushed forth and filled the pits of Grond. Morgoth went ever halt thereafter. So also, when Beren and Luthien made their way into the deepest hall in Angband where Morgoth sat, Luthien cast a spell on him, and suddenly he fell. As a hill sliding in avalanche, he hurled like thunder from his throne, lay prone upon the floors of hell. The next section is of Beleriand. When Treebeard strode through the forest of Fangorn, carrying Merry and Pippin, each in the crook of his arm, he sang to them of ancient forests in the great country of Beleriand, which was destroyed in the tumults of the great battle of the end of the elder days. The great sea poured in and drowned all the lands west of the Blue Mountains, called Ered Luin and Ered Lindon, so that the map accompanying the Silmarillion ends in the east with that mountain chain, whereas the map accompanying the Lord of the Rings ends in the west, also with the Blue Mountains. The coastal lands beyond them on their western sides were all that remained of the third age of that country, called Osiriand, land of the seven rivers, in which Treebeard once walked, to quote, "I wandered in summer in the elm woods of Osiriand. Ah, the light and the music in the summer by the seven rivers of Osir, and I thought that was the best." It was over the passes of the Blue Mountains that men entered Beleriand. In those mountains were the cities of the dwarves, Nogrod and Belagost, and it was in Isiriand that Beren and Luthien dwelt after they were permitted by Mandos to return to Middle-earth. Treebeard walked also among the pine trees of Dorthonion, the land of pines, to quote, "To the pine trees upon the highland of Dorthonion I climbed in the winter. Ah, the wind and the whiteness and the black branches. Winter upon Orad Nothon. My voice went up and sang in the sky. That country came afterwards to be called Tornufwin, the forest under the night, when Morgoth turned it into a region of dread and dark enchantment, of wandering and of despair." The next is to quote of the Elves. "The Elves appeared of earth far off in the distant land beside a lake named what? Gwynfinien, the water of awakening, and thence they were summoned by the Valar to leave Middle-earth and passing over the great sea to come to the blessed realm of Aman, in the west of the world, the land of the gods. Those who accepted the summons were led on a great march across Middle-earth by Valar Oromne, the hunter, and they are called the Eldar, the elves of the great journey, the high elves, distinct from those who, refusing the summons, chose Middle-earth for their land and their destiny." Sorry, checking the time. "But not all Eldar, though they had crossed the Blue Mountains, departed over the sea, and those who remained in Beleriand are named the Sindar, the Grey Elves. Their high king was Thingol, which means grey cloak, who ruled from Menegroth to the Thousand Caves in Doriath. And not all the Eldar who crossed the great sea remained in the land of the Valar, for one of their great kindreds, the Noldor, the Lawmasters, returned to Middle-earth, and they are called the Exiles. The prime mover in their rebellion against the Valar was Fëanor, maker of the Silmarils. He was the eldest son of Finwë, who had led a host of the Noldor from Gwynfinien, but was now dead. And in my father's words, the jewels were coveted by Morgoth the enemy, who stole them and, after destroying the trees, took them to Middle-earth and guarded them in his great fortress of Thangorodrim. Against the will of the Valar, Fëanor forsook the blessed realm and went in exile to Middle-earth, leading with him a great part of his people. For in the pride he proposed to recover the jewels from Morgoth by force. Thereafter followed the hopeless war of the Eldar and the Edain, the men of the three houses of elf friends, against Thangorodrim, in which they were at last utterly defeated." Before their departure from Valinor, there took place the dreadful event that marred the history of the Noldor in Middle-earth. Fëanor demanded that those Teleri, the third host of the Eldar on the great journey, who dwelt now on the coast of Aman, that they gave up to the Noldor their fleet of ships, their great pride, for without ships the crossing to Middle-earth by such a host would not be possible. This the Teleri refused utterly. Then Fëanor and his people attacked the Teleri in their city of Alqualonde, the haven of the swans, and took the fleet by force. In that battle, which was known as the King's Slaying, many of the Teleri were slain. This is referred to in the tale of Tinuviel, the evil deeds of the gnomes and the haven of the swans. And it says, to see page 130, lines 514 to 19. Fëanor was slain in the battle soon after the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth, and his 7 sons held wide lands in the east of Beleriand between Dorthonion and the Blue Mountains. The second son of Finwë and Fingolfin, the half-brother of Fëanor, who was held the overlord of all the Noldor, and he with his son Fingon ruled Hithlum, which lay to the north and west of the great chain of Ered Wethrin, the Mountains of Shadow. Fingolfin died in single combat with Morgoth. The second son of Fingolfin, the brother of Fingon, was Turgon, the founder and ruler of the hidden city of Gondolin. The third son of Finwë, the brother of Fingolfin and half-brother of Fëanor, was in earlier texts Finrod, later Finarfin. See page 104. The eldest son of Finrod / Finarfin was in earlier texts Felagund, but later Finrod. He, inspired by the magnificence and beauty of Menegroth in Doriath, founded the undergrounded fortress city of Nargothrond, for which he was named Felagund, Lord of Caves. Thus earlier Felagund, which later Finrod Felagund. The doors of Nargothrond opened onto the gorge of the river Nargod in the west of Beleriand, but Felagund's realm extended far and wide, east to the river Sirion and west to the river Nenning, that reached the sea at the haven of Eglarest. But Felagund was slain in the dungeons of Thu, the necromancer, later Sauron, and Orodreth, the second son of Finarfin, took the crown of Nargothrond as told in this book, page 109. The other sons of Finarfin, Angrod and Egnor, vassals of their brother Finrod Felagund, dwelt on Dorthonion, looking northwards over the vast plain of Ard Galen. Galadriel, the sister of Finrod Felagund, dwelt long in Doriath with Melian the queen. Melian, in early texts, Gwendoling and other forms, was a Maya, a spirit of great power, who took human form and dwelt in the forests of Beleriand with King Thingol. She was the mother of Luthien and the foremother of Elrond. In the 16th year after the return of the Noldor, ending many years of peace, a great host of orcs came down from Angband and was utterly defeated and destroyed by the Noldor. This was called Dagor al-Gareb, the glorious battle. But the Elvish lords took warning from it and set the siege of Angband, which lasted for almost 400 years. The siege of Angband ended with a terrible sadness, though long prepared, on a night of midwinter. Morgoth released rivers of fire that ran down from Thangorodrim and the great grassy plain of Ard Galen that lay to the north of Dorthonion, and was transformed into a parched and arid waste, known thereafter by a changed name, the Gaping Dust. This catastrophic assault was called Dargor Balgolak, the Battle of Sudden Flame, which can be found on page 106. Glaurung, father of dragons, emerged from Angband, now for the first time in his full might. Vast armies of orcs poured southwards. The elvish lords of Dorthonion were slain, and the great part of the warriors of Beor's people, King Fingolfin and his son Fingon, were driven back with the warriors of Hithlum to the fortress of Ethiel Sirion, known as Sirion's Well, where the great river rose in the east, face of the Mountains of Shadow. The torrents of fire were stopped by the Mountains of Shadow, and Hithlum and Dor-lomin remained unconquered. It was in the year after the Bargolak that Fingolfin, in a fury of despair, rode to Angband, and he challenged Morgoth. Now we're going to stop there because finally we can start Beren and Luthien, which I'm going to do in the next episode because I appreciate there's so much to try and take in. so much information that is required to understand the story. So I hope it was okay. And the next episode, we will properly start Beren and Luthien. But I'm just going to show you this, the illustrations. They are beautiful, and I will make sure to show you throughout. But please do return for part 2, where we can start Beren and Luthien and delve really deep into that connection. I'm so excited to be able to start this journey with you. So please stick around. I'm not going to nag you, but I am going to prompt you to do all those things that you need to do to support my tiny channel. And I hope you return. Thank you.